Hello, everyone. We're going to get this session rolling. Welcome. We are very appreciative of you spending this time with us. We know we have a bit of a tough time slot here. We're competing with the developer keynote, so we're extra grateful that you're here with us today. And so hopefully by this point at Next, we've convinced you that it takes more than just a model to be successful with generative AI. It truly takes a platform approach. And so hopefully you heard that through the keynote yesterday and through the spotlight sessions as well. What we're planning to do today is actually dive into a few more of the considerations you should keep in mind when deciding how to invest in an AI platform for your organization. My name is Lilly McNealus. I'm a director of outbound product management for Vertex AI. I'll be joined today by Advait Bopardikar, a Vertex AI outbound product manager, and Asif Hasan, the CEO and co-founder of one of our incredible partners, Quantify. So I'm sure you've seen quotes like this, or you've said quotes like this. I think that nobody's going to disagree with the idea that there is an incredible opportunity for every organization to transform with generative AI. The emergence of generative AI has truly democratized AI, and it's made it accessible for far more organizations and users than ever before. And you've probably seen stats like this from McKinsey or from a consulting firm or an analyst organization that for organizations who are able to capture that value, they're going to see major economic impact in the form of productivity gains and efficiencies across their organizations. But that's really hard, and that's not quite happening today. And so we're still seeing that a lot of this potential value is trapped in pilots and POCs and ideas. And I think never before have we seen so many pilots being kicked off. But now, here's one stat from Gartner, only 54% of those projects are actually making it to production. I was actually at dinner with a partner on Monday night, and they told me this number in their world is closer to 90%, which is really shocking, that it's just increasingly even more challenging for these projects to move to production. And that's for a couple of reasons. Of course, it takes identifying the right use case where there's potential to drive business value for the organization, and we see a lot of companies not doing that from the get-go. There's also the idea that, and we'll talk more about this, you really need end-to-end tooling to actually productionize these models at scale. You need to have the right management of ROI to actually be able to prove that when these models do move to production, you're seeing the return you thought you would see, and you can show that to the rest of the organization as well, because we all know that this is an investment. It's going to take time and resources to actually realize these gains. And lastly, with the proliferation of models and data, there's just more governance that's needed. You need to have the right security posture, the right compliance in place. You need to have thoughtful approaches to responsible AI that map to the needs of your organization. And all of these things are not easy. But we've seen them before. And so for those of you who are working in the space of predictive AI around the time of the pandemic, we had a bit of an eye-opening moment. And what you can see on this chart is actually what happened with the predictive models that were deployed at the time and were supposed to be predicting consumer behavior. And very rapidly, with the onset of COVID, that consumer behavior changed. All of a sudden, the historical data that these models were trained on was no longer reflective of the behavior of consumers. And maybe this is just an ugly chart, but the reality is that this actually led to significant losses for organizations who are making inventory and purchasing decisions based on these models. And so that was really, I think, the first time that this concept of MLOps in the predictive world landed and opened people's eyes. And things such as, how do I monitor these models more effectively to understand when they do go, off track and are no longer actually predicting behavior? How do I have the right explainability tools in place to know why this is happening? When I do get that new data that is actually reflective of consumer behaviors, how do I automatically retrain those models so that I can actually get over these hurdles sooner rather than later? And so I think that was the beginning of the thinking around MLOps. And we're here again. And so I think here you can see, not just in the space of generative, but we're also seeing growth in predictive. And what this means is that the complexities that exist within organizations who are working with both of these models are just increasing exponentially at this point. The opportunity is increasing as well, but you need to have the right mindset and the right platform in place to actually realize that opportunity. And the good news is that a lot of those learnings that we realized through sort of the course of our predictive AI journeys are benefiting us today when it comes to generative AI. And so when you think about the end-to-end workflow of moving a model from creation or pilot all the way to production, at a high level, those stages of the workflow are very similar, right? You're discovering or you're creating models. You're evaluating them, and you're experimenting, and you're developing, and then you're deploying and you're monitoring. But with the emergence of generative AI and the behaviors of these models, there are a lot more differences that have been created as well. So augmentation, as an example, is something that didn't really exist in the age of predictive. Now with tools like grounding and approaches with RAG and connectors and extensions, there's a lot more to manage in this space, and it's a bit more complex. There are also areas where things are quite similar. When you think about a model registry, you still want to be able to look at all of the models, whether they're generative or predictive, through a single pane of glass. So at the high level, it's great. We've been here before. We know what this workflow looks like. But under the hood, there's actually quite a bit more detail that we need to dive into in order for us to actually effectively invest in platforms that meet the needs of our organizations. And so you can see here on this slide, with everything that's blue is actually new with generative AI. Everything that's green is stuff that we've done before, or we need to expand and modify to meet the needs of generative models. And so this is why we think it's really important that we look for platforms that meet the needs of those building with both generative and predictive AI, so that we can realize the efficiencies of those platforms where there is overlap in workflow and help our teams better collaborate together, though those platforms do need to expand to meet the needs, the new needs of those building with generative AI. So with that, I will hand it over to Advait to walk through a few more of the steps of the workflow in a bit more detail.
Morning, everyone. My name is Bopardikar, product manager. And really, I want to start with a bit of a confession that this part of the talk isn't actually about answers. What it's really about is it's about questions. And it's more specifically the questions that you need to consider when you're going through the process of purchasing or using an AI platform. What I want for all of you today is to have a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding of the workflow that your technical counterparts are doing, and make sure you understand how to actually ask the right questions when you think about which platform is going to help us enable and capture some of that economic value. So to do this, we're going to use this exact same framework that Lilly had put up on the slide earlier, and we want to walk through each one of these step by step. And our first stop is going to be around curation of models. So when it comes to actually picking a model, there are a number of things that you need to keep in mind. First of all, in machine learning, we've typically said that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And what that really means is that no one model is actually optimal for every single task. Right? There are some models that are going to be better for other purposes. They may be because of performance, but they might be also because of cost. They might be because of latency, for a number of other reasons. So today, you may be choosing from proprietary models like Google's Gemini or Anthropic's Claude. You might be picking something that's open source like Gemma, or you might be using something from Mistral. You might be picking models that are trained in a multimodal fashion so they can be used across a number of use cases, or picking something that is intended for a very narrow use case. So for example, you might take a task-specific model for translation, or something that's trained in a domain like MedLM for medical questioning. Now, we've got models. The next step, we actually have to customize those models. In the era of predictive, we're really starting with what you would call hyperparameter tuning. However, that's not really what we're focusing on when it comes to generative AI. The first step for tuning these models is prompting. So this is a very natural thing to do. You can pretty much start with a basic prompt. Let's say we're trying to build some sort of travel companion app, and we asked it that we need help planning a trip to Las Vegas. That's fairly simple to do. But you may find that this only gets you the completion or the success of what you're trying to achieve 50% of the time. So now you have to go to the next phase, which is prompt engineering. With prompt engineering, now you're using best practices of how that particular model behaves, and every model is slightly different, and you're trying to improve the likelihood that it's going to complete a task. So you might first start by giving it a bit of a persona. So in this case, it's a travel agent. On top of that, you make some specific tasks that it needs to complete, like finding a hotel, looking for for flights, and also maybe making some suggestions for dinner restaurants. After that, all the user has to do is tell you where they're going, in this case, Las Vegas, and maybe some additional details like this is for business travel. And if you do this, you might find that, OK, well, now we're actually 80% successful in getting the outcome that we want. Pretty good bump. Unfortunately, not good enough. In order to get into production and make sure that our customers are actually going to touch this, we need this to be much better than just 80% correct. And that's where the next phase comes in, tuning. So with tuning, now you're taking a number of examples of inputs and outputs of how you want the model to behave in a circumstance, training it specifically to do that task better. And some of these training data points may come from the 80% of success you had in the prior phases. And now what you're going to find is that this model performs much better than it did in the past. Maybe it's 95% accurate, and that's maybe good enough to go into production. OK, great. So we're ready to go into production. But unfortunately, there's a lot of experimentation that we just talked about. And how are you going to manage all that experimentation? What do we need to consider in terms of the tools to do that experimentation? Do you have a platform that's going to help you actually tune and tweak the input parameters of the model? Do you have tooling that's going to allow you to then make adjustments to the prompts and compare those prompts? Once you compare those prompts, how are you going to document the ones that you're going to use and why and how you should use those prompts? After you've done the documentation, what are you going to do about sharing and discoverability? Has someone else actually figured out a solution to my use case, and can I just pull from their learnings rather than reinventing the wheel every single time? And then finally, now that I have a version of a prompt, perhaps I'm going to continue to iterate on it. So what do I look to for lineage? How has that prompt evolved over time, and how can I do a rollback if I ever require to do so? On top of that, when it comes to going through the process of fine-tuning, there's a number of different types of tunings. Which one is the right one for me? And which options do I have available? Here's 4 versions of the most common ways you may tune a model that we're going to talk about. The first one is pre-training. With pre-training, the intention is, can I train the model information about my proprietary data that wasn't in the original model training data set? Now, this requires a large number of unstructured documents from your proprietary data mixed with a bunch of data that comes from the original training source. So there's actually a lot of complexity and cost that goes along with it. Instead, what most people end up doing is fine-tuning. Fine-tuning tunes a subset of the model weights, and it's specifically focused on teaching it how to do a task, not necessarily learning brand new information, but how to complete a task better. After that, there's RLHF, or reinforcement learning through human feedback. The intention of this is, how do I teach a model things like tone, something that's hard to describe with business rules? You're trying to get it to understand what a human would prefer, and this is somewhat an ineffable thing to try to optimize on. And finally, there's distillation. Sometimes one model is a little bit too large, a little too wieldy for my use case. So with distillation, you take a larger teacher model and you use it to train a smaller model that's more cost-effective, more efficient, and potentially faster. On Vertex AI, what we do is we offer 3 of these. We focus on fine-tuning, reinforcement learning, and distillation step by step. Now, all this tuning sounds like it's a little complicated, perhaps a little bit costly. How are we going to maintain and manage our ROI if we have to do all these tuning tasks to actually get to production? And that's where there are a number of different models that people have taken in the market. So one approach is charging you a one-time fee. That fee is just the cost of training, usually in the order of hundreds of dollars. The next is a very nominal fee that someone may charge you, specifically for hosting or storing that model. But this happens on an ongoing basis. The next approach might be to say that, actually, we're going to increase the cost of serving. Every token you provide is a little bit more expensive. Or maybe I'm going to charge you an additional hosting fee for every single hour that model is up. And then finally, the most expensive approach to this might be to say, well, you need to have a dedicated instance of a model. It runs on your own specific hardware. And even if the model isn't being used, it's costing you money while it sits there idle. So you need to have a use case that has enough volume to justify something like this. On Vertex AI, the only thing that we charge for is just the cost of training. Now, we've talked about customization. What about the new stuff? What about augmentation, unique to generative AI? And on top of that, I mentioned earlier on that pre-training is used oftentimes to train new information. But what if you don't do pre-training, how am I actually going to bring information in that is unique to my organization into these models? So one approach is RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. A lot of people will say, well, I have a vector database. I can use embeddings, take my documents and put that into a vector database. Unfortunately, solving search isn't as simple as just having a vector DB. There's a number of different tasks that you need to think about. Firstly, where am I pulling the information from? Perhaps it's being dynamically updated, so you have to have a collection pipeline. After that, how are you parsing these documents? You may have documents that are in spreadsheets, HTML files. You may have ones that are in text files. Each one of these has to be processed slightly differently. After that, the document needs to be chunked, meaning it's broken down into subsections. Should those subsections be sentences, paragraphs? Should they be whole pages? all these decisions have impacts on the way that your model is going to behave. After that, you need to actually use an embedding model. Which one is right for you? Again, this goes back to choice. Do you have embedding models to choose from? And can I fine-tune that embedding model to work better for my purposes? And then lastly, where am I going to store all this information? Which vector DB is going to be most performant, both by cost and speed, for my use cases? And that's just the ingestion pipeline. When it comes to actually making an inference, now I have to think about how do I convert a query into an embedding? How do I use that embedding to do a lookup? How do I make sure that lookup is high quality? How do I then take those documents that are retrieved, pass it to an LLM, generate a response from it? And then how do I do that all with low latency so users actually want to use the system? There's a lot of complexity there. So on Vertex, there's two options. Option number one is you can use Vertex AI search. Completely turnkey out of the box. You load the documents in, and you let Google figure out how to do search for you. Option number two is you can still choose to DIY. Maybe you want to have something completely bespoke, a workflow that isn't solved by the out-of-the-box approach. Well, now what you need is you need orchestrators. So we offer a number of managed orchestrators on Google Cloud. On top of that, you need all the underlying primitives. So you have a number of options of text models. You have a number of options for embedding models, all of which are tunable. And then underneath, you have a number of options when it comes to vector DBs, connections to APIs, tools, and even grounding on Google search. So we've talked about customization. We've talked about augmentation. How do we know if we're actually doing the right thing? How do we know if our models are working the way we want them to work? That's where validation comes in. Now, there's a number of different statistical validation methods that have been used with predictive AI. The challenge with generative AI is sometimes you're trying to optimize on things that are hard to describe. Things like tone. Is the tone right? Or how do I know that the model is grounded in fact? This is a bit of a philosophical question, like what exactly is truth? A little hard to know sometimes. On top of that, we have to say, well, do people like the kind of response I get? Is it too long? Is it too short? Too many bullet points? So doing all this evaluation is quite manual. It's quite time consuming, and perhaps you just need an army of people to solve that problem for you. But I think a lot of people are going to say that that's maybe a bit challenging, and that's why we launched Auto Side-by-Side. So what Auto Side-by-Side does is it takes a large language model, trains it on the human preferences that you have for your use case, and allows that model to do the judgments for you. So it takes something that would have taken a group of people to review by hand and automates that process by using large language models to train and judge the other large language models. OK, so we've validated the model. We've deployed it. We're starting to make some predictions in production. The question is, how do I know if this model continues to perform well? Kind of like we saw with drift with predictive models, how do I know that this model is no longer performing as nicely as I would like? And that's where monitoring comes in. So with monitoring, when you build an agent on Vertex agents, you can see the full trace of the conversation that a user had with the agent. You can see exactly the tools that the agent chose to use and what it passed into that API. So if you're doing a booking of a hotel, you need to make sure that the model understood that it needs to call for flights, look for hotels, look on Google Maps for restaurants, and then pass in appropriate information based off of your date and other specifications like, is this for business travel, luxury travel, or are you going on a budget? All right, so we've monitored, but now we also need to think about governance. And this is sometimes the trickiest part that people really struggle with. And governance means a number of things. The first thing that people ought to think about is responsibility and safety when it comes to generative models. And most platforms have some form of a safety filter or governance pipeline. And most of them will cover things like hate speech or violence or sexual content. But there's a number of other things that businesses care about, right? Perhaps you don't feel comfortable with your large language model that is helping people do a booking, but at the same time has political opinions or provides legal advice or provides healthcare advice. So how are you actually identifying those kinds of situations and blocking them from happening? Do you have configurations over those kinds of filters? And another thing that I think a lot of people forget to think about is, do these filters work in a number of different languages? Perhaps you're dealing with customers that are around the world. They aren't necessarily explicitly speaking in English. But on top of that, malicious actors often use non-English languages to jailbreak these models and get them to do things that you did not want them to do. So are these safety filters trained to work in a number of languages, not necessarily just the highest ranked ones? Now, another thing that's, I think, top of mind for a number of organizations is, well, what happens if the model outputs text that is verbatim from some other source? How do we actually appropriately attribute that or cite that? So with citation metadata on Vertex AI, we can identify if spans of text come from a third-party source on the public internet and then provide that citation for you. This works both with text information as well as code that is generated. So even your developers who may be referencing things that live on someone else's code repos can also provide those appropriate citations. All right. So there's a number of questions, and we're going to maybe recap with a few more to think about, to maybe sum all of this up. So the first thing is, well, if you're trying to capture value, what are you doing in terms of understanding the platform capabilities, and how are those platform capabilities going to help you get to production? You don't get value if you just have a pilot that sits on a shelf. You actually have to get to production. On top of that, does the platform combine capabilities of both generative and predictive? So your teams that are working on these problems have a shared understanding of the workflow and a shared understanding of the processes and culture around getting to production. Third, every use case is going to be a little bit different. Models are constantly changing. The state of the art is always different, and there's always a new model every single day. So the question is, do I have a broad range of options? And can I swap in and out models that are appropriate for my use case over time, or tweak and tune them based off of my specific needs? Next, do we have access to tools that are going to allow us to easily customize and augment this information with our enterprise data, or do we have to build pipelines completely by scratch? And then finally, when it comes to this governance, what do we do about governance and safety to make sure that these things are running in a way that we feel comfortable with? So hopefully those are giving you a lot of questions, not yet answers, but we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation. So I want to have a bit more information on what people are doing in the industry. So in just a moment, we're going to have Asif join us on stage, and Asif is the CEO of Quantify, and he's going to share a little bit of what we've done in market with our customers. Welcome.
Thank you.
So just as maybe to get everyone up to speed, can you tell us a little bit about Quantify, what your team does, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the questions that the customers are asking you.
Sure, Advait. Hi, everyone. My name is Asif Hasan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quantify. Quantify is an applied AI and data science software and services company. We started life as an applied AI company 10 years back. At that time, most of the people we were running into thought of us as a bunch of nerds doing glorified science projects. So over the course of 10 years, we've made a number of pivots, and now we find ourselves at the epicenter of all of this generative AI revolution. We became Google partners in 2016 through a relationship with Google research team, where we started to use TensorFlow, and through that we came into contact with Google Cloud, and we were a team of about 120 people back then. Today we are about 3,500, so 30x growth in the last 8 years, and we've also accumulated 13 Partner of the Year awards over this time, mainly in the data and AI space. So that's a little bit about us.
Amazing. And so you obviously have a great perspective on the market. We'd love to hear a little bit more about what are the top questions you're hearing from customers when it comes to generative AI?
Sure. Yeah, it's been an interesting shift over the last 18 months of evolution of generative AI. So if you turn the clock back, let's say 15 months or about even a year back, a lot of the questions that we were getting were all focused on why. Why should businesses care about generative AI, and why now? Over time, this has shifted more to what and now how. So in the middle, we heard a lot of questions about what are the most feasible and impactful use cases where businesses can benefit from generative AI. And lately, all of the questions have been about how. How do we build, deploy, and lifecycle manage generative AI systems? How do we scale up our talent? How do we govern these more responsibly, et cetera? So the shift has been pretty profound. I've never seen this type of a shift in my career in terms of really the intentionality and the belief of this technology, and its impact on business.
Great, and we've been speaking today specifically about platforms. So how have the customers that you've worked with been thinking about platforms and models together, and how they make that investment?
Sure. Again, I think early on, if we turn the clock back, even about a year ago, most of the conversation that we were running into was all about the foundation model performance. People were obsessing about MMLU benchmarks and other mechanisms to sort of understand the efficacy of the model itself. And they were doing a lot of experimentation, proof of concepts, et cetera. And this was all stitched together with glue code with the foundation model in the middle. And what people quickly realized was that you start to accumulate a lot of technical debt if you follow that. So eventually, in the recent months, the conversation has shifted a lot about the platform, the end-to-end pipeline, the lifecycle management of these systems, et cetera, all the things that you explained, Advait. So the conversations now are more focused on how do I have a platform that has a lot of connectors into my source systems? What are the ingestion mechanisms? How do what are the right types of embeddings I choose? And if I'm going to build a RAG pipeline, what are the right retriever techniques? It's on the outbound side, it's more focused on guardrailing the models. So how do I make sure that it's not responding to out-of-topic conversations, and how do I ensure that the response that it does generate is sort of in line with the value system of the organization, et cetera. So that's one shift that we've seen in recent months. The other significant shift has been in the sort of acceptance of open source alternatives as well. So about a year and a half back, it was, there were only a few open source models that were out there when we first started working with this. A couple of years back, Google Flan T5 was very popular. In the recent months, we've seen Gemma and Mistral and others. So organizations are now realizing that they do need an entire model repository. And the trade-off between performance, latency, cost is very real. So they need to have a set of options available in their platform to enable the right use cases. So those are some of the shifts that we've seen happen in the market.
Okay, great. And yeah, again, today's talk was very biased towards generative. I think everyone's very interested and excited about that. Yeah. But in the chart earlier, we saw that there's still a lot of spend and still some growth happening in the predictive space. So I'm curious to hear your take on where do you see predictive going? Do you think it stays as a trend? Do you still see the value in it? And is there an overlap on how those two technologies may work together?
Sure. Yeah, I think these are two distinct but complementary approaches to AI. And they have different, very, very distinct applications. And they'll work very well together and can be very powerful if done right. So from a predictive ML standpoint, the thing that made it very hard and cumbersome is that these models require a lot of label data to train on, and they are very task specific. So you have one model that will do one thing and only one thing right, and that made it expensive, time consuming, and lengthy for organizations to build. But it is very powerful for that one task that you need done, right? So examples would include fraud detection. That's a very high value use case, which uses a lot of predictive AI, customer segmentation, time series forecasting, et cetera. So there is a place for predictive models, and the blue dots, I think, rightly showed that this is going to continue to be a dominant theme. From a generative AI standpoint, the advantages that you see is in the time to value, because these are pre-trained models. They can support a vast variety of tasks, and with a little bit of fine-tuning, you can make it work in a lot of different scenarios. And so the time to value increases, and that increases the success rate and the adoption, et cetera. That's why we are seeing so much velocity in this. And in terms of looking at scenarios where they can be combined to make the entire system more powerful, we've seen things in customer acquisition and retention scenarios where you'll use a predictive model for customer segmentation, and then you'll use a generative model to exactly personalize the type of persuasive messaging you might want to send a individual customer in that segment. So that works very well together. In other scenarios where we've seen predictive and generative work very well together is, for example, in AI-assisted medical imaging. You have predictive models that might look at biomarkers and classify the presence or absence of a disease state. But these models also need a lot of data to train on, so you can synthetically generate clinically valid training sets using generative AI and then use it to train those models. So both on the inbound as well as the outbound side, generative and predictive can work very well together.
Awesome. So taking a look beyond the technology, we'd love to understand if there are any overlooked challenges that you've seen organizations run into as they're working towards deployments of generative AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenges around generative AI more or less remain the same as predictive AI in a strictly non-technical sense. So as organizations start to move towards activating the generative AI initiatives within their organization, the first obstacle they will typically run into is just creating an appetite within the organization for generative AI initiatives. And here I think having an executive sponsor who's a true believer in the technology, understands a little bit of the experimental nature, gives the team the ability to test and learn, evolve, that becomes really important. The other non-technical challenge that we've seen customers encounter is the prioritization challenge. Now, generative AI is such a general purpose technology that you can apply it to a whole host of scenarios. So finding the most feasible, the most impactful use cases that can get you a set of quick wins and build momentum. That's another one. Third non-technical challenge we'll run into is finding the right talent that can build, deploy, and manage these systems. And if you look at the type of skills that are needed to do it right, it's quite unique. You need a team, a team that understands machine learning well, understands software engineering well, understands managing systems at scale well as they understand the industry and the domain really well, right? So this type of confluence of factors in a single team is almost like you're looking for unicorns. So that's the third one. And of course, I think the final one I want to talk about is risk and governance. So it's important to get the risk management, governance, InfoSec team members, bought into it. So these are all, whether it's predictive or generative, they remain the same with minor nuanced differences. But yeah, those are the ones that we typically will run into.
Awesome. And for companies you've worked with who've been successful with generative AI deployments, are there any key patterns you can share, other than, of course, working with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our work with customers so far since inception of generative AI, and we started with generative models back in 2019 when Google open sourced BERT, and we were working with customers to build AI tutors. So we've had a little bit longer history than when ChatGPT started. We've done about 300 plus customer engagements, and about 75% of them are actually in production or moving into production. And we have uncovered 4 very specific scenarios that were true in all of the ones that made it into production. So the first one was they all started with a really precise definition of what success looks like, had a good business case, had the ROI metrics, identified the acceptance criteria, et cetera, identified. So they did a lot of upfront thinking on what success looks like. The second scenario, the second condition is almost all of these were ones that engaged the risk management and InfoSec teams early and had a discussion that, if these conditions are met, what would it take for us to take this model or this application into production? So the pathway with InfoSec and governance teams was already set. The third important thing is they were very intentional about curating the content or the data that will serve as context for these models. And the source of truth that they were using was validated. And then finally, the fourth was that when you're moving an audience from just a typical application with point-and-click interface, and now you open up a bar where they can search and ask any question, it's not a very natural transition to go from point and click to formulating prompts and asking questions. Well, you show how how it went from 50 to 80 to 95 with prompting the systems well and fine-tuning. So they were also very intentional about having a change management team that was going to enable the end users to actually work effectively with systems that need prompts instead of points and clicks. So these were 4 conditions that made it very viable for production scenarios.
Amazing. So I think with that, we'd like to thank Asif for his time, and thank you all for joining us for our session today. Please take advantage of all the special offers. We're not exactly sure what those are, but they sound really cool. So please do scan the QR code and see what offers exist for you. Oh, wait, I went too fast. People are scanning now. Let me go back. Okay, I'll give a pause there. I'm sure they're really cool. So feel free to take a picture of that one. And then we also would love your feedback on this session. We've enjoyed sharing some of these insights with you, so feel free to provide feedback through the app. And with that, we want to thank you. So I hope you're having a great Next. And we'll be around.